Dick Cheney, the former vice president of the United States, died on Tuesday. He was 84 years old. He had long issues with his heart. He died of pneumonia, along with some complications from that heart. I wanted to make a video about him because I feel like Dick Cheney is, to the extent he's known nowadays, it's for his last two major acts in American politics. One, the time he spent as vice president from 2001 to 2009 under George W. Bush. And two, his endorsement in 2024 of Kamala Harris and his broader turning away from the Donald Trump version of the Republican Party. Now, both of those things are obviously really, really important. But Dick Cheney is a guy who has spent 50 years in and around Washington politics. And I would argue is one of the most influential people over those 5 decades. So I want to make 2 points about Cheney. Because I think whether you like him or you hate him, it's hard, and very few people feeling differently about Cheney. I think it's hard to argue that he didn't matter. I think he mattered in a very real way, both in the Republican Party, but also in American politics and the American presidency more broadly. So I want to make 2 broad points in this video. Point number 1, Cheney got his first big job in Washington in 1974 at the age of 34. He was chief of staff to Gerald Ford. I'll talk more about that in a minute. He last mattered in the presidential election in Washington politics in 2024 when, as I said before, he endorsed Kamala Harris. That is a 50-year period of relevance in Washington and in American politics, and I'm not sure many people can rival. I mean, that is an incredibly broad and long time mattering in American politics. And yes, how much he mattered waxed and waned some, obviously, but he always, when he appeared or said something, it mattered for 50 years. That's point 1 I want to make, and I'll explain more in a minute. Point 2, and this is critical, I think Dick Cheney fundamentally remade what it meant to be and what the American vice presidency could be. John Nance Garner famously described the vice presidency as, quote, not worth a bucket of warm piss. Well, Dick Cheney showed that the vice presidency could be worth a lot more than that, and for good and for bad, and I'll talk about that as well. But those are the 2 things I really want to hit on. Before I get into all of that, I do want to make 2 points. 1, I want you to subscribe to this channel. I am independent from big media, independent from the 2 political parties. I am authentic, always telling you what I think is right, not what you want to hear. I hope you subscribe to my channel. Number 2, today is election day in at least some of the country. I am doing a live stream on YouTube with my friend Chuck Todd, former NBC anchor of Meet the Press, with the great folks from Decision Desk HQ. We will be calling races. We will be analyzing. We'll be interviewing people. We will be having fun. You can check it out 6:30 p.m. Eastern time. It is free. It is on my YouTube channel. And I really hope it's election night for people who care about elections. We're going to have fun. You're going to see this background a lot. So I hope you come and check it out. Okay. So Cheney. So point 1 I want to talk about is the breadth of how long this guy mattered. So as I said before, he comes to Washington and he works for a member of Congress named, the last name Steiger, from Wisconsin for his first few years. But he kind of falls in with Don Rumsfeld, who is this rising star in Republican politics. In 1974, Rumsfeld is named Secretary of Defense by Gerald Ford. He had been serving as chief of staff for Ford. And Rumsfeld's deputy White House chief of staff is a guy named Dick Cheney. So Dick Cheney at 34 years old becomes the chief of staff to the president of the United States. He is the still youngest person to ever hold that job, 34 years old. 4 years later, he goes back to Wyoming, not where he was born, but where he was raised, and he runs for Congress. He serves in Congress for a decade, during which time he rises up to be the number 2 ranking Republican, the House Minority Whip. Remember, these are the days when Democrats controlled the House for decades. So Cheney was always in the minority in the House, but he wound up in leadership. In 1989, so basically a decade and a little after he was elected to Congress from Wyoming, he is named as Secretary of Defense by George H.W. Bush. And he serves in that role and then leaves. He went to go head Halliburton, gigantic energy company. And then in 2000, he returns back sort of oddly to lead George W. Bush, the son of the president that he had served as Secretary of Defense, George W. Bush's vice presidential selection team. he's the guy, the sort of eminence grise, who's going to interview all these people and sort of, do the background checks on them and then advise then Governor George W. Bush who he should pick. Well, lo and behold, they do the search, and Dick Cheney winds up as the vice president, which I had never seen before. It's like, hey, you're going to be the guy who organizes this. Oh, and you picked yourself. And that role, I think, largely comes to overshadow everything else he has done in his political life. And his time as vice president is defined almost immediately by the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks. Cheney is without question along with Rumsfeld, who is still kicking around, Secretary of Defense at the time, they come to define the American national security and foreign policy response to the attack on September 11th. Cheney is a face of the notion and a voice of the notion around the world that Saddam Hussein in Iraq has weapons of mass destruction, that Saddam Hussein was somehow potentially involved in Afghanistan, in what happened with Al-Qaeda and September 11th. Cheney, thanks to his time in Congress, helps push through the Patriot Act overwhelmingly. He is involved in warrantless wiretapping, which we did not know about until it was reported in the mid 2000s. He is the face of that. Now, Cheney eventually recanted on the weapons of mass destruction many years later. But for a very long time, he insisted they had done the right thing. Obviously, in hindsight, we were led to war on erroneous grounds, and Dick Cheney played a big part in that. Now, a lot of people don't know this. In 2004, Cheney actually offered to drop off the ticket because he was worried he had gotten this reputation as Darth Vader. Literally, that's what people called him, and they were worried that he was worried he'd be a drag on the ticket. Bush kept him on the ticket, but ultimately, I think his legacy is going to be he was, if not co-president, right? He was the most influential and powerful vice president ever. So I've seen him described as a cabinet official with sort of much, much broader powers. Cheney was across almost everything, particularly in the national security and foreign policy space. And look, the war in Iraq wound up costing $2 trillion and went on for 9 years. And that absolutely plays a role in how we think about Dick Cheney. But I would say the breadth of Dick Cheney, right? So he leaves office, obviously, in 2009. Because of his health and because he's not a particularly good candidate, I would note. I mean, he was always a good policy, a smart policy guy. I don't want to say a good policy guy, but a smart policy guy. He's never really considered as someone who would run for president. I just want to read one thing. The New York Times obituary has an amazing line about Cheney and how he was not a good politician. I want to read this. Quote, an overweight, laconic, and rather wooden grandfatherly figure with a nimbus of white hair and eyeglasses that caught the light, Mr. Cheney looked like a man on his way to the dentist. He was affable, but had no flair on the stump. He did not kiss babies or wade in the crowd. So he was never going to be a candidate. But I will say, his daughter, Liz Cheney, took his seat eventually from Wyoming, that Wyoming at-large seat. She rose up, like he did, into the leadership of the Republican House, the Republican conference. But unlike Dick Cheney, she had a massive falling out over over Donald Trump's rise. Liz Cheney was a huge critic of Donald Trump. Donald Trump set out to beat her in a primary, which he did help her do. A woman named Harriet Hagman beat her in 2022. Dick Cheney became a very outspoken critic. Although he had been critical of Donald Trump throughout, he had endorsed Trump in 2016. He became a much more vocal critic. And then in 2024, he endorsed Kamala Harris, basically saying he was putting country over party. Okay, so from 1974, when he was a 34-year-old chief of staff to Gerald Ford, to 2024, Dick Cheney mattered in American politics. That is an amazing, amazing feat. That's point one. Point two, Cheney and the remaking of the American presidency. I mean, I don't think remaking of the American vice presidency. I don't think anyone would doubt that what the vice presidency was before Dick Cheney and what people thought it could be versus what it became under him is vastly different. I want to read something that the New York Times wrote in their obit. As vice presidents go, Mr. Cheney was a singular figure, more powerful and less ambitious for higher office than any vice president in modern times. They say a consummate Washington insider, Cheney was an architect and executor of President Bush's major initiatives, deploying military power to advance, they said, the cause of democracy abroad, championing free markets and deregulation at home, and strengthening the powers of a presidency that, as both men saw it, had been unjustifiably restrained by Congress and the courts in the aftermath of the Vietnam War and the Watergate scandal. I want to dwell on that point a little bit. Yes, there's no question that Dick Cheney was the most powerful vice president we have seen in the modern era, and maybe ever. I still think George W. Bush made the ultimate decisions, but there is no question that the landscape and the framework in which those decisions were made was shaped by Dick Cheney more than any other person and more than any other vice president. But I do want to, even though he obviously has had a massive falling out with Donald Trump, I do think that Cheney and Trump had one thing in common, and I think you are seeing the seeds Cheney planted being realized in Donald Trump, which is that expansion of executive power, right? We know Donald Trump is doing that. I want to read a quote. This is from years ago from Dick Cheney. He said this, quote, "I believe in a strong, robust executive authority, and I think the world we live in demands it." Donald Trump would absolutely agree with that. So while Dick Cheney did not like Donald Trump, he was resistant to how Trump talked about immigrants. He was very opposed to sort of what Donald Trump did on January 6, 2021. He did help install the idea that the executive branch's power could be far more wide-reaching, whether it was the president or the vice president, far more wide-reaching than people thought before. So even though Dick Cheney is now gone, I think his legacy, whether it's with the Iraq War, whether it's with the extension of the extension of the vice presidency, the extension and expansion of what the executive branch could do, are still very much being felt without any question. Okay, that's it for me. As I said, tonight, 6:30 p.m. Eastern live stream, Election Night 2025. I really hope you check it out. It's free. It will be right here on my YouTube channel. I also hope you like and comment on this video. It helps me grow my community on Substack. It also helps me get out to people who aren't already subscribers. Last thing, be an evangelist for me. Tell a few people about what I'm building here and why you think it's important. Independent and authentic. Those are my promises to you. Okay, everybody, take care.